Should Utah football be considered a top 10 team heading into the 2023 college football season? We're talking about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. If this is your first time joining our show, make sure you guys like and subscribe. We'd love to interact with you guys in the comments, and we greatly appreciate all of you guys who have subscribed to our show and continue to support us and make us your first listen every single day. On today's show, we're talking preseason rankings, where Utah should rank going into the season, which teams they should be above, and we'll close with some big questions as it pertains to Utah football. And in order to help us do all of that, it's AP voter and KSL.com's Josh Furlong. And Josh, as for should Utah be considered a top 10 team heading into the college football season, I would say no. I'd say just outside, though. I think that's kind of the consensus, too. I think almost everyone I've seen has Utah in that top 15, a lot of at 14, kind of 15, on the cusp of top 15, but still in the top 15 nonetheless, which when you have a team that's won back-to-back Pac-12 championships, that's led by one of the best coaches in college football, and Kyle Whittingham, has some of the best coordinators on both sides of the ball, and has so many key and returning players on both sides of the ball too. I think they deserve to be in the top 15. And I mean, as another reason too, I feel like this team should be top 15. Like, I know they lost some really good players, Dalton Kincaid, Clark Phillips. I also don't know if there's as many teams in the country, like if you lose players of that level, like you have a replacement, like, I mean, Brant Keithy replacing Dalton Kincaid. When they were both on this team, Brant Keithy led the team in receiving yards. Like, there's a chance he could have an even better year than Dalton Kincaid did. I'm not saying yet it's going to happen, but there's definitely a chance with what he's accomplished. And look, Miles Battle's not going to be Clark Phillips III, but to get a guy with that much SEC starting experience to step in then and help out and kind of fill that void, that's where I feel like that Utah does belong in the top 15. I think I'd personally have them at 12, but I think as long as they're in the top 15, I feel like that's where they should be at.
Yeah, this is one of those situations where outside of Cam Rising being hurt, I think they're a lock for a top 10.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's the issue, right? I think this is more based on Utah's schedule. They're playing 11 Power 5 teams this year. You know, that's a really daunting and difficult schedule. Their only easy game is a Weber State team that, you know, under new leadership, but they've been decent. They're not going to be easy games this year, and so that's tough. And then you mix into that the Cam Rising injury. It's easy to be able to see Utah top 15. Now, with that being said, could they move up 100%? Could they move down? It's all relative at this point based on where Cam's going to be. But I have to agree. I think they are easily in top 15. I haven't really got into my, starting my top 25 look this year. I've kind of given myself a little bit of a break to make sure that I can get ready for the season. But this is an area where I think Utah is anywhere, probably like you said, the 12 to 15 range. There's going to be a lot of teams there that Utah could be ahead of, could be below. But I think this is a good spot for them. You know, you're back-to-back champions. Nobody's going to take you as the underdog, even though, being in the top 15 still will be kind of like that peg that people say, like, oh, they're underdogs based on what they've done. So I think it's a good spot for them. You want to be continually ranked. The fact that you can be in the top 15 in preseason rankings is always a good sign for a program. So, whether they're 25 or 15 or 1, which obviously they're not going to be, I don't think it matters. I think preseason is just a good benchmark for where this program is. And I think if you're 15, that's perfectly fine.
100%. Preseason stuff is, I mean, you can add a few things of bulletin board material, right? And sometimes you just make stuff up to motivate yourself too. Didn't some Georgia football players say someone projected them to only win 5 games after they won the national championship? Like, somehow they got to that. I was like, I don't know what Kirby Smart's telling these guys, but man, I respect it because it's got to have them fired up and motivated. So Utah doesn't need that, but I'm sure they do feel a little bit slighted that, hey, if we are 2-time back-to-back Pac-12 champion, not only are there other Pac-12 teams ranked ahead of us, especially at USC, who you beat twice. I can understand the frustration there. And some of these other programs who haven't proven it yet, but could be on the cusp of maybe making a comeback. That's what it's going to be interesting to kind of look at and see how it all works out. And I thought one of the things you did a really good job right there was highlighting the reasons why Utah wouldn't be maybe in the top 10 right now. You mentioned the players recovering from the injury. I think that's the biggest one. I think when you look at a Cam Rising, when you look at a Brant Keithy, like we expect them to be ready to go based on recent reports. We've heard that they'll be good for the Florida game, but when you're dealing with injuries like that, there's still some trepidation. What level will they come at to? And obviously the schedule is the huge one, especially because another thing I had written down for like why you'd be low on this Utah football team is their performance on the road last year. The worst game I think I've seen Cam Rising play in the last 2 years was when he went up to Oregon and tossed those 3 interceptions through that critical 4th down at Dalton Kincaid's feet. The UCLA game was just an all-around bad performance pretty much from the team overall, some costly turnovers, some poor defense as well. So I think when you look at their schedule this year, those kind of go hand in hand when you know you have to go to Corvallis, who was this team's only true loss when Cam Rising was the starter back in 2021. You have to play a really good Washington team, and that's a team, too, that Utah was lucky they got to avoid last season. Look, maybe Utah would have been able to beat the Huskies, but that would have been an extremely tough out. And then the other road game, of course, is going to USC. And I know Utah's had USC's number as of recently, but that's still Lincoln Riley, Caleb Woods. Like, that's still a daunting task. So I do think it makes sense for them not to be a top 10 team just for those reasons we highlighted there.
Yeah, I think this is a scenario where Utah, there's a lot going for it, but a lot going against it, right? Like, I think, you can listen to Kyle Whittingham and say, oh yeah, Cam Rising, we're cautiously optimistic that he's going to be ready for that Florida game. I have my doubts personally. I just don't think there's a lot of people that come back from an ACL injury with the ability to be able to be kind of a full-fledged player within that amount of time frame. Most return in about 9 months, and even then you're not fully healthy, right? Britton Covey, if you remember a few years ago now at this point, he tore his ACL, and if I remember right, it was the Pac-12 championship game. The next year he came back, and he still, he was making progress, played a few games, and then had to come back to do a redshirt season because he just wasn't feeling that good. So, it's easy to be able to say, oh yeah, he's making strides and he's doing this. And for the most part, a quarterback's going to be okay, better than maybe like a Brant Keithy who, he's got to figure out how he can manage that knee with pivoting and everything, how he's got to juke out players. But it's one of those things where a quarterback's going to take hits, right? You've got to be able to be mobile in the pocket. That's kind of part of Cam's game. And I think Utah's going to be better at the offensive line, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a scenario where they need to rely on his running. But every quarterback has to escape, right? This isn't the NFL where you've got linemen that are, these amazing talents that hold that line and keep Tom Brady up. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
This is a scenario where, these are college players. They're not always the best. And you've got to be able to keep a quarterback up that has, quite honestly been injured. Last year, I mean, you talked about that Oregon game. Part of Utah's problem was Cam Rising was injured, right? I mean, he wasn't able to fully work with his injuries that he had, and that limited his game. So this is a scenario where Utah, they're fine. They've got all the pieces to be able to be okay, and you have to like what Utah has at the running back, put the depth. Jaquindon Jackson, obviously, a lot of people are excited about him, and I think if Jaquindon is who we expect him to be, this Utah team probably doesn't need to rely on its quarterback as much. Now, we've seen this work. You have to have a quarterback, right? But this is a scenario where Utah's going to be okay. They're going to be okay. Now, everything could go to pot. First 2 games could be losses, and everything's going to be, a struggle, especially if Cam isn't ready and there's no optimism that he can. Because trying to put in a redshirt freshman quarterback as well as Brandon Rose, who is, probably the likely projected starter should Cam go down, that's still a tall task, especially in this conference this year where you've got some of the top quarterbacks in all the nation returning. You've got a defense, luckily, that can help you, but this is going to be a tall task. And so, for people who are optimistic that this is a three-peat year, yes, it's possible, but that's not an easy task. And I think this is going to be a very difficult road for Utah.
That's why we've seen so few teams do it. And Utah needed some luck at those tiebreakers last year just to be able to go back-to-back too. So it's going to be interesting to see how it does all play out. And Josh, if Utah does start 0-2, especially if they lose to Florida, please pray for my YouTube mentions. I know there's some Florida fans who've been very much coming at me about the first game, and I've been feeling good about it, obviously, but we'll have to see how that one plays out. And, we mentioned Florida. There's another team in Florida State who's ranked above Utah and just very high on this list in general. And I think that's an interesting conversation about where Utah should rank and which teams they should be above or behind overall in this. We're going to touch on that in a moment. But first, we've got to talk to you guys about our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Baseball season is in full swing, baseball season is in full swing, with basketball season having just wrapped up. So baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers getting no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. There's so many great opportunities you guys can get in on the action at FanDuel. All the bets, whether you're looking at Shohei Ohtani and the season he's been having, and he continue to keep it up. Do you think your team will be able to keep their momentum going? Do you think your team that maybe if they're in the dumps a little bit, do you think they'll be able to turn around and roll off some wins? All those and more odds are available at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to snag a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon college, or excuse me, just locked on, all caps, FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball trademarks used with permission. Also, this week, you guys know the NBA draft is here, and Locked On's NBA mock draft special is here. It's bigger than ever. Follow along the entire first round in a 6-episode ultimate mock draft experience. Only Locked On can deliver. All episodes are available now on Locked On NBA Big Board and on YouTube, wherever you can listen to your podcast. You can also bet on the NBA draft at FanDuel, although I would not recommend betting on the first overall pick. I don't know if there's much success there, but outside of that, could be some other fun stuff going on there. So make sure you guys head over to that and give Locked On mock NBA Big Board a listen today. Josh, coming back into this one, we are pulling we're talking about Utah in general. The reason we're having this conversation is Utah was ranked 15th overall in a college football rankings post spring put out by ESPN's Mark Schlabach. If I mispronounced his name, I apologize to him, but he put out this ranking with these teams. And I think when you're just looking at it overall, like just going down at Georgia's number 1, no surprise there. Michigan is number 2. Florida State at 3 is very high to me. Now, honestly, I don't feel like bad saying like I look at Utah and I'm like, I just like what they're capable of doing. I have them higher than a Florida State, I think personally, and it's because of what they did. And I understand Florida State has a Jordan Travis, who's one of the 5 best quarterbacks in college football. Mike Norvell does a very good job. But I am looking at a team that lost 3 games in a row last season. They didn't beat a ranked opponent. So to me, that is someone I would look at. And there's a bunch of other teams on here too that I would feel comfortable saying, like, I'm not saying Utah should be 3. There's a bunch of other teams I feel like should be here. I'm surprised at Florida State's placement here. And I don't feel bad saying like I have Utah above Florida State heading into the season.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of love for Florida State based on, kind of the trajectory. And I think a lot of people want to get back into that rich history of Florida State and what they're able to do. And,
yes.
and obviously being able to have that. But I'm with you. Like, I don't know if that I'd put them 3. Could you make an argument for it? Sure. They've got a lot of returning players. I think they have 16 total returning players out of the 22 slotted. So, I mean, they've got the team available. Like you said, Mike Norvell is a great coach and is able to do great things there. So I think there's possibilities there, right? I think, we kind of swing too early on a lot of these teams where it's like, okay, they had a good season, but to your point, they didn't beat a top 25 team. They had a 3-game losing streak. There's scenarios where they're there, but they're not quite there. And to say that they're number 3, even over, I could argue that you could put USC at number 3. I know a lot of people love them. They have the actual Heisman Trophy winner who's probably not going to lose that, at least barring, a season that they have. But I think this is a scenario where a lot of people are kind of a little enamored by what Florida State's done based on the history of what this program is. So I don't know I'd put them that high. Maybe top 10. I don't know yet. I'm curious to go through all these teams as I kind of dive into it more as the season gets closer. But it's definitely a team that's moving up, right? I think this is a team that's fun to watch. I think they're probably the preeminent Florida team right now. I know a lot of teams in Florida, Miami and Florida general would be not too happy about that. But I think they're probably the ones that have the best trajectory for this season. But 3 seems a little bit too high for me.
First of all, just the Florida, I think there's no doubt with Florida State. I mean, I know Miami's got Mario Cristobal, Florida with Bill Napier. They're trying to get to the level. But when you look at what Florida State did last year, look, I mentioned they lost those 3 games in a row. Those were their only 3 losses. Like outside of that, they were still a really good team. So there's a chance they're good. But I love that you brought up the tradition of college football just in general and how sometimes it factors into preseason rankings. Josh, how many people have tried to be the first ones to say Texas is back? It seems like every single year we have people going, Texas will be top 10 this year. Texas that. Texas is one of the teams where it's like, I would still have Utah above them. Look, I know Quinn Ewers could be really good. There were also games where he was not very good last season. He looked great against Alabama early on, but then some injuries and some stuff there. And we mentioned with Utah, like look, Dalton Kincaid was like the player for them on offense, right? You're replacing him with Brant Key. Bijan Robinson is gone, and it's not like you're replacing him with the top 3 running back. So a lot more will be on Quinn Ewers' shoulders in that situation as well. And is Texas' defense finally going to turn around? Like, it's just one of those things I want to see to believe it. And the same thing goes for a Notre Dame team here. A Notre Dame, I understand why they're in the top 15, and they're above Utah. I don't love that. I'm very surprised at how low this list is on Oregon. I think that's with a Bo Nix coming back. They have Oregon all the way back at 15 too. And I know we're obviously, we get to see more of the Pac-12 schools, so maybe we'll be higher on them than maybe some people are. I've talked about that East Coast, West Coast bias is a thing a lot of times, but with Notre Dame and Texas in particular, I feel like those are two teams that are definitely just the reason they are ranked so high is a lot what we've talked about, just the brands overall and people being like, they're going to be back. But I mean, I'm old enough to remember, Josh, or I should just say my memory's good enough. Notre Dame lost to Marshall last year. Like that did happen.
Yeah. This is a funny thing to me. I always love every time a preseason top 25 comes out, the team that I'm always looking for is Texas.
Yes.
Just because everybody has to have Texas high. And I get it, right? Like you have an alumni base and a donor base that is rabid about this team. And it's kind of interesting because you look back at Texas last year, and if you look at the advanced analytics, there's a reason to make that Texas was still one of the best 25 teams in the country last year.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at their record, they weren't, right? Like they lost a team. And granted, some of them were fluky, right? If I remember right, they had that, was it the Alabama game that it came down to a field goal, or I feel like it's.
Yes, no, the Alabama game came down to a field goal. Quinn Ewers got hurt as well. It seemed
That's
like
right.
had Ewers been healthy, Texas would have gone on to win the game.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's things that can go, the other way. And I think obviously Texas seems like it's, on an upward trajectory. I think they've got some good things going for them. But to that point, like you said, Bijan Robinson was a big part of their offense. I don't know. I love that Texas is, I think they have them, 10th in this list right
10th.
here. Okay, 10. I don't know that I'd put them 10th. I'd probably put them close to that range about Utah. I'd probably say about 17, 18. Now that I'm saying that, I'll probably rank them higher in my preseason. I don't know. I'm just kidding. But it's interesting to me to see kind of what this team is. Notre Dame's the same. Notre Dame, I don't have any qualms with. I think they're kind of in that middle of the road scenario with Utah as well. What's quarterback play going to be like?
I like Sam Hartman. You're right.
Exactly. So I think, I'm not too worried about that one. I think, it's going to be an interesting scenario with that, but Texas always surprises me. I think that's always that team that I look at. I kind of laugh every time I see it. But it's what it is. A 10, I think, is still too high, but I think, top 20 for sure is probably within their range.
Yeah, I mean, I would have them in the top 22. This is the part to me that's just funny about preseason rankings and what we do. Like, one of the reasons people are high on Texas is they have 9 returning starters on offense. They have 6 returning starters on defense. Texas, in their last game of the season, played a team called Washington in the Huskies Den in the Alamo Bowl. We know what that is a Texas home game. That's not like Washington back. That's a Texas home game. Washington won. And Washington has Michael Penix coming back. Washington has a ton of guys coming back. And they're ranked 2 spots behind Texas when the most recent game they played with a healthy Quinn Ewers, by the way, too. And there wasn't any Bijan on Texas at that time either. I'm pretty sure he opted out for the draft, too. So that's where, just to me, it's like, well, why isn't Washington higher again? That's where it's just it's interesting to see which programs people are and aren't on. One program I'm curious to see how they're going to be like you don't see UCLA is not listed in the top 25 here. Dante Moore in his first year, how are they going to perform? I think there's a lot of questions there, but that's one, if they were in the top 25, I wouldn't have a huge issue with. I'm glad Oregon State's in the top 25, and this is turning into a little bit of a Pac-12 thing in general, but I do feel like the Pac-12 teams are the ones who were slighted a little bit. I mean, this is as low as I've seen Oregon in a lot of these rankings. I think the Ducks are going to be very good this season. If Utah's home winning streak is going to come to an end this season, like if you're telling me Utah's going to lose a home game, I'm like, well, it's probably the Oregon one, right? I mean, Bo Nix and what they're capable of doing under Dan Lanning. Like that's the one that wouldn't shock me. So tying this full circle, I don't think it's bad that Utah is at 14. I think they deserve to be a little bit higher. And once again, just as you mentioned, I feel like a lot of these teams too, like we just see them get bumped up because of some of the brands and the expectations. And there's some unknowns on here too. I have no idea how LSU and Clemson are going to be this year. I mean, LSU was a team that did a lot of really good things, beat Alabama, obviously. That loss to A&M that late in the season was a real head scratcher. And look, I know Georgia was Georgia, so it's not the worst thing that they got blown out by that. I've seen a lot of Jaden Daniels. Can he keep it up and be the consistent guy for them? I'm curious of that. Clemson was really down last year, and I think that was a lot of people just tried to blame DJU with that. I think it was a lot more than him. I think it was losing coordinators and everything as well. And Garrett Riley comes in there. I'm curious with them. So like I said, I feel like Utah's placement is fair in here, but I definitely think there's a reason to believe they could end the season as a top 10 team just because of kind of the ceiling and floor some of these programs have is very drastic, Josh.
Yeah, this is a scenario where Utah could be either really good and still contend for maybe even a playoff. I don't know if I'd go quite that far, but maybe they can contend for that. Certainly at least a Pac-12 title.
Mm-hmm.
But this is also a season that Utah could win 8 games, right? Like this is I don't think fans kind of recognize like how hard this season is going to be.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, when you look at this, you're facing some of the best teams in all of college football this year. I think Oregon State's going to be one of those sneaky teams that, yes, they're going to be ranked, and a lot of people are going to be talking about them, but they're one of those teams that go to Corvallis, and it's a fun environment. It's very similar to Utah in a lot of ways of how they've been built and what they are able to do. I'm curious to see what DJ Uiagalelei does there and kind of how that scenario works. But I think this is one of those years where there's not going to be an off week for Utah. And as long as they can keep that depth, and as long as these transfers have come in and the recruits that they've brought in are able to deliver to the extent that I think many fans are going to, Utah's still going to be close to that 10-win season. But 8 wins is probably a good, if you told me 8.5 wins right now is kind of the over or under, I'd probably take the over at 9, but I would not at all be surprised if they got 8, right? And I think that's 100%. Just what's crazy about this season is it's going to be a tough year. And I think, fans should be locked into seeing a team that has, probably some of the best depth that it's ever had and still maybe only winning 8 games. Now, maybe we're crazy when this comes out later and at the end of the year we look back and Utah's won 11 games.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case, but this is a year where I probably have the least read on kind of what this team is going to be, just based on how Cam's health is going to be and just what these other teams are in the Pac-12.
I mean, we've talked about for so long, the Pac-12 cannibalizes itself. And this year it's really going to, and it's because there are so many good teams. Not like because there's just one team that's better and then, they had the bad loss. It's like almost all these teams are going to lose games, kind of like they did last year. When you look back at all these teams' losses, it's like, who did Oregon lose to? Like Oregon State, and how they lost Oregon State was bad. But in general, like, it's not bad to say you lost the Beavs with how good they were last season. USC losing to Utah twice, like that was a really good Utah team, as we know too. So they're not going to be a lot of bad losses in this in general. And I mean, look, when I did my schedule prediction, I had Utah going 10-2. But if you told me, I totally agree with you. If you told me Utah lost 4 games, I'm not surprised at all. Look at this schedule: Baylor, Florida, all these elite Pac-12 teams, 3 of the most difficult road games you can have in a season. You're telling me Utah lost 4 games, maybe even 5 if you have injuries and stuff go wrong. Not surprised by that at all. So that's what is going to be fun is there. I mean, sports are exciting when we don't know what's going to happen, right? This is what we like. It's not like when you get Georgia versus TCU in the national championship game and you're like trying to talk yourself into TCU because they somehow beat Michigan. And then after the very first drive, you're like, I can change the channel. And I didn't want to be saying that after the first quarter, but just sometimes that's how it goes overall. So it's going to be interesting to see the season that Utah football has. And Josh, the last thing I was curious to get your thoughts on was when you're talking about this team, we've mentioned some of the biggest questions and kind of things that they have to answer and figure out. You mentioned it earlier, talk about the offensive line a little bit. And I think you said you feel pretty good about the offensive line overall. My one concern, in fact, my biggest concern overall with this team actually probably is the left tackle position. I like Falcon Kaumatule. I think he can do good things. Replacing Braden Daniels is going to be tough. And look, sometimes you have the Bam Olasenis of the world who come in out of nowhere and they step up and do an outstanding job. But that's just the one position to me. I look all over the rest of the roster and I'm like, well, I feel good. Like, I feel like I know what this is. And you feel good about like who's stepping in to do things in that spot for this team. So that's where, for all those other positions, I feel really good. But when we talk about left tackle, that's where just Falcon is the biggest question mark for me. But what is the biggest question for you about this roster?
Yeah, real quick, I'd kind of agree with you there. Although I would say that if Utah's putting you at that spot already this early,
that's true.
I feel like they at least have a lot of faith in you. Now, that can be different. But I think regardless, Utah's going to find the 5 best players, and maybe that's the Spencer Fano gets in there, right? I'm curious to see how he works in. But I don't have any doubts about that offensive line. I think, based on where Jim Harding got the team last year, he's read the feedback. He's heard what the criticisms are, and he's done everything he can to improve it. And he's got the talent and the depth to do it. For me, the biggest questions, I'm not going to even touch the Cam Rising stuff because we've touched that a million times. Yeah. That obviously is going to be the linchpin in the season, I think. But I think the biggest question for me outside of anything else, and I'll kind of say 1A and 1B, is 1A is going to be the wide receivers. Can the wide receivers produce to the level that Utah really needs them to? You're going to have great running backs, and you've got the depth there to be able to really do whatever, right? You can take some injuries. You can take some issues there where if one guy's not producing one day, you've got 19 other guys. I'm being facetious there, but you've got a lot of guys there that can, produce at a high level. So you need somebody that can kind of stretch that field. You need some guys that can be able to do it. Utah's gone out and they've gotten Pittman, they've gotten Simmons, they've gotten Mikey Matthews is a freshman that's coming in that a lot of people are really high on, and I'm personally really high on because I think he's done a lot in spring.
Showed a lot.
So I think you've got to be able to have that. Now, the 1B is going to be on the opposite end of that is the corners, right? You lose
Yeah.
Clark Phillips, but they've got guys that are going to come in and kind of produce. I think they've got the talent there. It's just a matter of can they step up to the level that Utah needs them. Utah's got, I would say Utah's probably got a better defense this year than last year, and at least talent-wise and the ability. I think we're going to see probably less blown assignments than what we had last year. But this is going to be one of those areas. If those corners get beat, especially in a game against like USC, that one's going to be probably the biggest issue, or maybe even against Washington, this could be a really tough season for Utah. I don't see that. I think Miles Battle is going to be one of those guys that steps up. I think you've obviously got Zamiah Vaughn that's really starting to come into his own. But those two position groups on opposite ends of the football, I think, are going to kind of be where Utah's season lies. If they can get success on both sides of the ball in those areas, I think this team is a pretty well-stacked team, and I think they're going to be okay.
You make a great point. I mentioned earlier I wanted to see a guy like a Quinn Ewers put it all together. We saw flashes and moments from the Utah receivers last season, but we also saw moments where it's like, where are you guys right now? Like, can you step up here, make a play? And they weren't able to do that always. So that's where I think this season, I think they'll be able to do that, but it's not a sure thing. There are so many talented receivers in this conference. It's going to put a lot of pressure on Zamiah Vaughn, JT Broughton. If you need one of the freshmen to step up, maybe a Smith Snowden or a CJ Blocker has to play early. How are they going to do under the lights? And Miles Battle coming in. And as you said, we know he's not going to be Clark Phillips, but I think there's going to be pressure on him to still produce for this team. How's he going to handle that? A lot of questions and things this team still needs to figure out, but not as many as some of the other programs in college football because of the returning starters. And that's why we still feel good about them being a top 15 team overall. And Josh, it's June 19th, the time we're recording this. And it's crazy to think that, looking at it, we're less than 2 months, or a little over 2 months, from the start of the college football season. So if people want to get some more Utah football content, where should they head over to?
Yeah, you can always view my stuff at ksl.com or on Twitter at j4ksl. It's a little slow right now, but we're getting ready to kind of start ramping up, let the NBA kind of have their draft and do all that. But we'll start ramping up here soon with Pac-12 Media Days in July and kind of have some fun that way. So I'm excited. I'm excited to get back to football.
I'm glad that we can all give the NBA draft their 1 week. That's what the NFL draft gets like 3 months. The NBA draft, just because the timing and when it has to be at, it's like,
that's all you need, honestly.
Yeah, we get 1 week for to talk about everything. So it's just always funny how the sports calendar works out. But Josh, appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes, but we'll see you tomorrow as Dante Guardi of Utes will be joining me to talk about some Utah recruits who have recently visited campus. That'll be on tomorrow's Locked On Utes.